As everyone knows, I believe once this incident happened, the chief of police for Madison Police Department called in the sheriff's department to conduct the investigation, which frankly is very professional protocol in a situation like this. The sheriff's department conducted a thorough investigation. There is abundant evidence in this case. Once their investigation was completed about a week ago, they turned over the evidence to my office, and in the past week, we have reviewed the evidence, especially that which is pertinent to our inquiry as far as criminal law goes. And in doing so, there was approximately 5 personnel in my office that reviewed the evidence. Myself, Chief Trial Attorney Tim Gann, Chief Investigator Jim Cook, Chief Deputy Mark Sandlin, and we concluded that review. Let me say this to the public. What we've done for the last week is what we do in any case of this nature. Anytime you have officer involved, use of deadly force, this process goes on. So this is not some new event or procedure that we had to do. And specifically what we're doing in a case like this is looking to the specific legal issue in criminal law of whether the officer was justified in the use of deadly physical force. And it's basic self-defense law. That's what you're looking at. For you to be justified in the use of deadly physical force, you have to reasonably believe that unlawful deadly physical force is about to be used on you, and that it's imminent. So that's the narrow focus of our review of this case. And as I've said, the evidence in this case is crystal clear. It really is. Most of that is because of technology. Between body cam and video footage and surveillance video footage from businesses in the area, the picture is extremely clear. After a review of all of that pertinent evidence, our conclusion is that the actions of Madison Police Department were entirely justified because of the clear evidence of what happened that day. And because of that, this case, as far as any criminal legal proceedings, is closed, and this office will have no further involvement in this case. What I want to do now, I'll introduce you to Tim Gann, Chief Trial Attorney in the office. And what Tim's going to do is run through an overview of the evidence for you of what we reviewed, and I'm going to turn it over to
part of the evidence that the Madison County Sheriff's Department provided to us. They put together this PowerPoint that really highlights the focus of what we are looking at in this investigation. I'm going to just walk through it with you. There's going to be some still photos from the body cam, and there will be some photos from some surveillance footage taken at the scene. So just bear with me as I walk through, but I'm going to try to give you just an overview of what happened out there in that parking lot that day. The call was started like most police investigations. A 911 call came in of suspicious activity that involved Mr. Fletcher. Namely, Mr. Fletcher was going into businesses there out in Madison and taking pictures and videos of employees and asking real personal questions. It was to the point where someone felt like they needed to call 911 and have it investigated, And even after the investigation started, after the shooting, it turned out that Mr. Fletcher had been trespassed from 2 businesses that day out there in the area for doing what he was doing as far as going in and making employees very uncomfortable. The first officer on the scene arrived, and this, as you can see, this is the van that Mr. and Miss Fletcher and their daughter were sitting in the parking lot. The door is open, and Mr. Fletcher is sitting in the passenger seat. The first officer arrived, officer number 1, makes his approach, and he makes contact with Mr. Fletcher standing in the door of the van right here. And when he makes contact, he addresses both Mr. and Mrs. Fletcher at that time. Now, immediately, Mr. Fletcher becomes aggressive towards this officer to the point where the second the officer makes contact, he reaches up and tries to shut the door on the officer. The officer continues to speak with Mr. Fletcher, but things go south pretty quickly. The Madison officer sees that Mr. Fletcher is non-compliant and becomes belligerent very quickly. At that point, he calls for backup. Mr. Fletcher continues to be non-compliant and aggressive, both verbally and with the door trying to shut on the officer. So he asked for backup, code 3, which means this is an emergency situation. Hurry and get here as fast as you can. You can see this is the officer's body cam. You can see where he's standing here. This is Mr. Fletcher. This is where the officer was standing when Mr. Fletcher tried to shut the door on him. Now, there's a timeline here, and at 4:45, this is a stop action photo of the body cam. Mr. Fletcher's pointing to his forehead, and he instructs the Madison officer to shoot me right here in the third eye. And he does that like 13 times, over and over again. And he also tells the Madison officer, you better shoot me if you're smart. He also begins to threaten the Madison officer, and within about a minute, he reaches over and puts his hand on a gun. He tells the Madison officer, it's over for you. You're going to put one right here, and he's talking about his forehead. When he touches the weapon, the Madison officer pulls his service weapon and instructs Mr. Fletcher to take his hand off the gun. That's the only time that Mr. Fletcher complies during this entire incident. He does remove his hand from the gun, but immediately becomes belligerent again and asking the officer to shoot him. The officer asks Mr. Fletcher if he is suicidal because he is adamant that he wants him to shoot him. And Mr. Fletcher's response are you homicidal? By this time, the second officer arrives on the scene and goes over to the driver's side of the vehicle. During the conversation back and forth, the Madison officer is doing his best to de-escalate the situation. He's trying to calm Mr. Fletcher down and just gain some information. And Mr. Fletcher's not having it. He continues to be belligerent. The officer sees that there's a small child in the vehicle, and that Mr. Fletcher's wife is in the driver's seat, and he instructs her to go ahead and get out of the car because he knows that Mr. Fletcher is going to be combative. She refuses. She locks the door. They ask her about 14 times to get out, and she refuses to. And Mr. Fletcher is to the point of being so belligerent that he reaches over and turns the ignition key off and holds the key and says, you can't tell her to do anything. He's adamant that even though she is in danger right now, he is wanting to keep her in the car along with his child. At that point, the second officer on the scene knocks the window out of the van to try to get Miss Fletcher and their child out of harm's way. So far, up to this point, the Madison officers have used every bit of kind of de-escalation and the use of force that they've used at this point is really proper in the force continuum, because they've shown up, their officer presence, they've given verbal commands, and at this point they are putting hands on Mr. Fletcher, trying to extract him from the vehicle. He is strong. He is a large man. He is an angry man, and they are not able to extract him from the vehicle by using their hands. So the next level of force up is less than lethal, which they employ two types of less than lethal force in this incident, with a canine and a taser. The canine officer arrives and gives Mr. Fletcher warning that he is going to send the dog on him if he doesn't comply, if he doesn't get out of the car. He refuses. At that point, Miss Fletcher is removed from the car with her child, and the first officer that is on the scene has moved out of the way because the canine is fixed to engage, and he has gone over to the driver's side of the van to try to assist getting Mr. Fletcher out the other side. He is going to attempt to use his taser to shoot Mr. Fletcher before things get any more out of hand, because the gun is still laying near Mr. Fletcher's left hand in the console. Now, as you can see right here, this is still Officer Number One's body cam. He has moved from right here around the front of the van to the driver's side, and this is his taser. You can't see it real clear right now, but this is Mr. Fletcher, and he has a gun in his hand right here, and he's going out the side to engage with the canine officer. The Sheriff's Department did an excellent job in pointing out and stop and frame on these photographs. As you can see clearly here, Mr. Fletcher has a pistol. It is a .40 caliber Taurus semi-automatic pistol. At this point, Officer Number One, who made the initial contact, is yelling to his fellow officers on the other side, "Let go of the gun, let go of the gun, he's got a gun." Because at this point, the canine officer that's engaged with him does not have his gun out. He's got both hands on Mr. Fletcher trying to pull him out of the van. There again, there's another shot of the gun. Now, here's Mr. Fletcher going out. Officer Number One shoots at Mr. Fletcher with the taser. I believe one hits him in the back, the other one doesn't make contact, and it's really ineffective at all. It doesn't have any effect on Mr. Fletcher. Now, this is Mr. Fletcher coming out of the van. This is the canine officer's body cam photo. You can see that they've got hands on him, and they've had hands on him for a while, trying to extract him out of the van. As you can see with that motion video, his hand is coming up, going towards the body cam, towards the officer. You can see here clearly that he's got a gun in his hand coming out of the van. That's a still frame of him coming out. There you can see the officer's hand pulling him out, and as he's pulling him out, he has a gun in his hand. Now, at this point, you can't see it in the video, but the canine has engaged Mr. Fletcher. In the initial, he was up inside the van with Mr. Fletcher. Now that Mr. Fletcher's coming out, the canine has disengaged and has re-engaged his right foot. You'll be able to see that with the surveillance video. But right now, they have hands on Mr. Fletcher. He's been shot with a taser, and a canine is on his foot, and now he's coming out with a gun. I'll stop that there. It's probably the best picture to get. Mr. Fletcher exits the van, the canine officer, Officer 3, is falling to the ground. Mr. Fletcher is coming out of the van, and he begins falling towards the canine officer. At some point, you'll be able to see it on the next video. He points the gun at canine officer's chest, also at his head. The canine officer is able to get his gun out and fires 4 rounds at Mr. Fletcher. At that point, Mr. Fletcher is struck multiple times. Officer number 4 that has arrived also shot Mr. Fletcher. At that point, they render assistance, call for medical personnel to come to give assistance to Mr. Fletcher. Now, this next video is surveillance video from the area. I'm going to walk you through it, and then at that point, we'll take some questions. This is surveillance video, and this is starts at about the point where Mr. Fletcher's coming out. You can see the gun in his hand here. You can see the canine officer engaged with him. He does not have his gun out, and now you can see the police canine attached to Mr. Fletcher's right foot. And this is going to be a frame by frame. This is basically what we just saw, but from a different view. You can see here the police dog is kind of invaluable in this situation because he has taken Mr. Fletcher off of his feet. The canine officer is getting tripped by the curb. He's going back, but the dog attached to his foot is keeping Mr. Fletcher from keeping his feet and helps him start to fall. Go ahead. You can see here the gun is pointed at the canine officer's chest area. Now, Mr. Fletcher's arms extended, pointed at the canine officer. The canine officer's gun is pointed at Mr. Fletcher. Now, he has lowered the gun to try to get a better shot at the canine officer, and the canine officer has done exactly the same thing. Now, as you can see here, they're pointing their guns at the same time at each other. The canine officer was able to get the shots off first. At this point, this is the materials, just part of the materials that the Sheriff's Department provided for us. Obviously, like Rob said, our focus is whether or not they were justified in using deadly force. This evidence is unequivocal that they were. And it was very well done by the investigators and the entire administration at the Madison County Sheriff's Department.
We'll take any questions y'all have.
What's the status of the forensic evidence? I know that was a piece of the puzzle that had not been finished.
Yeah, we got results on all forensics that we needed, namely consulting with the medical examiner as far as the injuries sustained by Mr. Fletcher.
And in regards to smashing the window out to get the wife and child out of the vehicle, was that to unlock the car door or to drag her out? What was the process behind that?
I think it's shown in the video, but she had locked the door. Ms. Fletcher had locked the door, and as Tim Gann has already said, there was a lot of officer awareness as far as this was a bad situation, and that you have a lady and her child in the car, and she refused to unlock the door, so the officers did what they had to do to get them out of harm's way. And you'll notice in the last frame that you can see them off behind the van, not even on the side of the van where the action was. So it was a job well done by Madison PD.
No matter how clear the evidence, why not just present it to a grand jury?
Well, you know, the best answer to that is it would be unethical on my part. It's unethical if a prosecutor presents evidence on a case that they don't think they can prevail in trial, much less when you look at the evidence here, I don't think a reasonable mind could ever find probable cause that that officer was not justified in what he did.
Can you guys maybe talk about why now you've decided to release surveillance video and the body camera video?
Because we don't release anything until we're done with it during the investigation. It's the integrity of the system. And probably your next question is going to be, well, why not just release the whole body cam? Which, and I've said this many times before, but you talk about the integrity of this system, of the justice system, whether it be criminal law or civil law. We're not a society where it's mob rule or public opinion that's going to rule. There's something that has to be guarded jealously in the system, that each one of us has personal rights, constitutional rights, whether you're somebody who's potentially accused of a crime or in harm's way or not. And I understand the public's desire. We want to know everything, but this is not an episode of Jerry Springer. This is the justice system. However, in making the conclusions that we make, we understand the public has interest in certain things, and we certainly will give an overview of the evidence, which is what we've done.
Can you say whose decision it was? Was it the district attorney's office decision to release that video? The sheriff's office, the Madison Police Department?
Which video are you talking about?
The surveillance and the body camera.
Yeah, well, first off, let me say this. There's certain evidence like body cam. What about the body cam video? It's not my property. I'm the district attorney, but I don't run an operation where folks are wearing body cams. That's the city of Madison PD as far as that legal issue of body cams. But as far as it was my decision as far as this particular evidence, and you notice I didn't release any evidence until we were done with what we're doing in this, and we are done. So at that point, I understand a certain public interest. We want to know what's happened, because there's been a lot of talk about what happened that nowhere is similar to what the truth is. So at that point, in the public interest, that's my decision to release that evidence for clarification.
I know the family has wanted to see this. Have they seen this before, or is this the first time anyone's seeing it?
This is the first time, to my knowledge, anyone has seen it. My understanding is the family is going to meet with the city of Madison as far as that goes. But, our lane is a narrow lane as far as is there criminal liability. And we guard it jealously, as I said. We don't try things in public. But we have done what we do, and we are finished with it. And in the public interest, I think that's an appropriate amount of information for the public.
What was the official cause of death, and how many shots were fired?
The cause of death is gunshot wounds. It appears that Mr. Fletcher was hit twice in the head, one in the shoulder area, and maybe some graze wounds.
Sheriff Fletcher that day claimed that they were there working out. Can you guys clarify if she was ever working out inside that gym and what these inappropriate questions were?
Now here's the thing, and I knew somebody was gonna ask that, but like I said earlier, our focus is a narrow focus of whether the deadly physical force was justified. So to answer your question, we don't go into that part. We go into police officers doing a hard job and doing what they do, and was it justified or not. So as far as extraneous facts, I don't know the answer to that.
As far as what you looked at, was it only as far as whether the officers had any criminal liability, or did you look at whether anybody else who may have been involved in this situation had any sort of criminal liability? Does that make sense?
You probably have to start with the result, and Mr. Fletcher lost his life. And you're looking at whoever was the cause of him losing his life. So our focus is on that, because we weren't looking at why did he not have tag on his back, you know. So we don't, Mr. Lawson.
Sorry, do you mind going back over the sort of the last little bit of that incident? He's coming out of the van. The officer kind of falls behind him. The dog seems to cause him to trip. No shots have been fired yet?
No shots had been fired at that time. The canine officer is falling back and the dog is engaged. The canine officer is getting his gun in motion as Mr. Fletcher is coming out, because he's kind of behind the 8 ball because he's got both hands on him. Once he hits the ground is when he engages with Mr. Fletcher.
So when we talk about pointed at the officer, we're not talking about at the van or at any point. We're talking about the stuff that's on the ground that none of the video that's been released up to now shows. Is that right?
I would say, you know, as you watch frame by frame, you do see that as he's still up, the gun is directing towards the officer. But once they hit the ground, then it's readily apparent when you see Mr. Fletcher extending his arm.
Now, just to make sure I'm clear on that. The officer who's face to face with him, he fired first. Do you know where the other officer shots came from?
The other officer came from around the end of the van.
The front end or the back?
The back end. All the other officers had moved to the back and trying to cover the initial officer that was engaged. And as they go down and hit the ground, the other shot, and it was just one shot, came from one of the cover officers.
That wasn't the officer with the taser. It was somebody.
It was not. There. It was one of the. There were 4 officers involved, or I think a 5th showed up. But the one officer with the taser, he was the initial. The canine officer is the one who engaged and fired shots, and then a 3rd officer, who was a cover officer, fired shots as they were going down.
So, that was my question. That second officer, in the process of Mr. Fletcher coming to the ground, or had he already landed on the ground?
He'd already landed on the ground. As you see, when he's pointing the gun, they're both on the ground, and that's when all the shots were fired. Everybody was on the ground.
I know you guys had said that he'd been trespassed from 2 businesses that day. So can you maybe explain if it was in the same complex, and if you guys had responded and he had cooperated, could he have been facing charges? Like what could come out of that call for a suspicious person?
And that's extraneous stuff. And really, what we're focused on is why the police were there in the beginning. A reasonable suspicion to go and approach and to investigate a crime, and that's whether or not they could have been trespassed or whatever is not really what our focus is. Our focus is why was the officer there, and the reason was it was a 911 call placed by one of the employees in a business there. That's the reason the officer was there. After the fact, they discovered that they had been in a few other businesses, he specifically, and was causing people to be extremely uncomfortable.
Right, we keep using the term uncomfortable questions. Can you guys shed any light on that at all?
No, and really that's not our lane. Just like Mr. Broussard said, what he was asking, whether or not he may have committed a crime before that, has nothing to do with the fact that was this officer justified in using deadly force, and that is really our focus. The Madison Police Department may have done an investigation on that, but that's not our lane.
Sure. There's been a fairly significant community conversation about this incident. Are there any lessons learned maybe from your office or Madison Police, or anything you guys take away from the situation?
I would say to the public that you have to be patient, and I appreciate patience, but the system works. It does. There's nobody in the system that's trying to cover things up or keep things from the public. And I understand frustration. I understand we live in a technological world now where we demand FaceTiming our loved ones or whatever, but you can't just erase the justice system and how it has to work. So I would always tell the public, just be patient and wait for the truth to be illuminated.
We know Officer Darby's case was a grand jury indictment, so can you maybe speak on how that case is different from this case?
I cannot. I'm sure the media is aware that there's a gag order in the Darby case, but I will say this much. The exact same process of what we do up here of analyzing every officer involved shooting was followed in the Darby case and this one, but I cannot speak to any differences or similarities in this case.
There's been discussion about the police response and, as you indicated, his refusal to get out of the van. I wondered if you could speak to this idea of what is a citizen's duty and what are a citizen's rights relative to being in their vehicle when police approach. And maybe there's a common sense piece of that too that you might want to speak to. But trying to understand that, did he have to get out of the van? Can you address sort of that interaction?
I think the overriding common sense thing that I would tell the public when dealing with the police is compliance. If this man complies, none of this happens. And we're not talking about infringing on his rights, because I believe the officer never asked him to exit the vehicle until he had probable cause to arrest him. The immediate response was a conversation that turned horribly bad because of Mr. Fletcher. But if Mr. Fletcher complies with just even giving the officer his name, which he refused to do, this incident doesn't happen. I think compliance with the public, with the police, is the answer. If you have issues with how the police act, you can always take it up at another time. But compliance at the time is really the issue we're talking about in this case, Brian.
Sorry, just to that, when you mentioned probable cause, that changing sort of the tenor of it,
Yes.
What was that?
Well, in the initial, you're looking at kind of a reasonable suspicion of I'm trying to investigate a crime. Then you're met with an extreme amount of hostility and belligerence, and then when he reaches over and puts his hand, they have probable cause to extract him out of the van at that time, and that happened within the first minute. This whole incident lasted for 9 minutes, and within the first minute, Mr. Fletcher had his hand on a weapon, and they could have arrested him right then, and in fact tried to. But for the next 8 minutes, it was a exercise in trying to de-escalate, trying to use other means other than deadly force to try to get it under control.